Hey guys, welcome back to the next video. In this video, we are going to talk about Jboss EAP training. Now, in this next generation first video, which is going to start with, right? So it's going to be about the architecture of this particular training session. Do remember that when you worked with the next generation Tomcat and WebLogic, which is already videos are created for, Kubernetes, Prometheus, and Grafana, it's not going to work just like that in JBoss as well. Because WebLogic and Tomcat doesn't have a actual structure for Kubernetes, but then we can actually create it because it's open source. But WebLogic has given you the structure for working with Kubernetes, like WebLogic Kubernetes operator. But when you talk about JBoss, well, you can actually use Kubernetes, but then that's a lot of manual work. But that is something I'm going to cover as part of this video. Why do I do that? Even though it is much of a manual work and it is not recommended from Red Hat or IBM, who is the current owner of JBoss, is because like when you talk about open source and when you talk about working with Kubernetes as a open source platform where you can enable your application server without paying any kind of a enterprise free fees, because when you compare the alternative, this is open source Kubernetes. So all you have to do is pay for the JBoss enterprise application to Red Hat or IBM, and then have this hosted on Kubernetes. But then that involves a lot of manual work and manual overload for you and a lot of time to be invested here. An alternative to this is OpenShift. Either you can go for a OpenShift managed cluster on a local system, or which is like in your data center, or you can actually go for Red Hat OpenShift console, which is console.redhat.com, in which you can actually host OpenShift, and you can actually host it through AWS or GCP. So you have to pay Red Hat, and then you need to pay AWS or GCP as well for the server provisioning. Or else you can use the same Red Hat OpenShift on your local system, where you can actually, it creates all this Kubernetes pods and JBoss installation. All those things will be autonomous and managed by OpenShift. Though there is a manual intervention in these two of it, but the manual intervention is so minimum because OpenShift uses Kubernetes power, but then it gives you an awesome console that you can actually work upon, and it doesn't feel like Kubernetes, you're working with Kubernetes, because what we will see in Kubernetes is like more of command line arguments and stuff to have this Kubernetes setup done. That is also covered as part of my training, the next generation. So this line tells you what is covered. This line tells you what is covered in mastering JBoss. So when you talk about OpenShift, you need to pay for OpenShift. It's not free, though you can actually download this and use it as a trial version, but not to be used on production, setup. But still, it's it can be used for only trial testing and development purposes, nothing else. But when you want to go for like a production hosted application, you need to pay for OpenShift. You need to pay for AWS or GCP to host this content. Or ROSA is basically Red Hat OpenShift on AWS, which means that you don't really have to contact Red Hat OpenShift. You can directly contact it from AWS. AWS will charge you the fees for the subscription of Red Hat OpenShift as well. And as well as like the same thing can be done for Azure or IBM Cloud as well. So these are like some of the direct connections, or you can actually use Red Hat OpenShift to connect to AWS or GCP. But eventually you have to pay Red Hat OpenShift, you have to pay AWS GCP, you have to pay for the software, which is Jboss. So you need to do this 3 different payments. So that's the difference between why we go for Kubernetes or OpenShift. OpenShift is much more stable, and Red Hat recommends you, if you want to deploy Jboss on cloud, you should go for OpenShift. I'm also going to cover that as part of the next generation training. So this includes the next generation Jboss includes the Kubernetes setup. The first thing we're going to see is Kubernetes setup of your Jboss installation. Though there is a remark saying we're going to use Docker instance for creating the image we need. Just like how we worked with Docker instance on mastering Jboss, same image I'm going to use for Kubernetes as well. So it is much recommended that you complete this training and understand about Docker and other stuff over here, and then come to Jboss. And why I say that, because a lot of components here we're going to use on Docker is actually taken from the main Jboss instance, which we actually worked on. So I've just exported that to this one, and then this exactly is is going over to the Kubernetes instance. So that's why I recommend for next generation, there will be obviously a requirement that you should complete the mastering JBoss training, and then we will take that forward to Kubernetes, configure Kubernetes and its components, and then work with it. Once we have set it up successfully, like for example, now this is a proper setup. This is what I'm talking about. So you have Kubernetes pods, you have replica set, you have deployments, you have the services. So through the services, I can access the JBoss cluster, and this is the deployed application. This is my console. I have slave 1, slave 2, and everything else coming through from the, you can see the slave 1, slave 2 is all coming from my Kubernetes server. So I have prod 1 and prod 2 server, which is part of the cluster group. They're all coming from Kubernetes. Now, how this is done and what we can do to get this done, we will see that on the hands-on session, but I'm just giving you an introduction to this. And then once this is done, then we will download a trial version of OpenShift and install it on our laptop machine. But that's going to be slow because the minimum requirement is 12 GB of RAM, free memory. So I will show you how to do it from the AWS machine. We can rent a machine from AWS, and then we can do the same setup as the local system setup. We will also be working with Red Hat OpenShift. I have the console over here. So this is your Red Hat OpenShift console with redhat.com. We'll also have the AWS over here. So likewise, we will be working on all front, try to deploy EAP, Jboss EAP on Kubernetes, OpenShift on a local system, OpenShift on Red Hat itself. And then we will also see ROSA and Azure as well as part of this training, or it will be added on a later point of time when it is relevant. But this is the whole understanding and the criteria towards Jboss OpenShift. Jboss EAP, which is going to be done on OpenShift and as well as Kubernetes. Thank you again for watching this video. I'll see you on the next one.